Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Gregor Kuntze. Gregor is currently a research associate with Dr. Janet Wronski's group. Gregor did his bachelor's in anatomical and physiological sciences at the University of Dundee in Scotland, followed by his PhD in biomechanics and physiology from Loughborough University in England. His PhD explored badminton biomechanics, and he was advised by Dr. Neil Mansfield and Dr. William Sellers. Following, Gregor did postdoctoral research at Cardiff Metropolitan University, exploring performance monitoring in track and field athletes, and also research with the NIG and Wronski groups at Calgary, exploring signal processing of EMG data and using biplanar videography to monitor OA progression. For 6 years, Gregor was the biomechanics lead for the V. Riddle Pediatric Rehab Research Group. Gregor has worked his way to the research associate position with Janet Wronski's group, and he currently explores machine learning approaches for biomechanics and imaging data analyses, using biplanar videography imaging methods and mechanical markers of OA. As a reminder, we'll first hear from Gregor for his presentation, and then we'll have a question and answer period to follow. So with that, you're welcome to get started anytime, Gregor.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction. So as Emily said, the topic of today's talk is gait biomechanics in children with cerebral palsy. And what the subtitle here is supposed to convey is that gait in CP is a really complex and challenging issue, both from a clinical and from a research perspective. And while I love a good challenge, I realized really quickly that I would have to throw all my research tools at this question, and I'd have to learn a bunch of new things in order to provide meaningful information on this research topic. And so in this presentation, I'd like to take you on that journey. So the opportunity to work with this population came from my work with Caroline Embry and Janet Wronski through the V. Riddle Pediatric Rehabilitation Research Program at the Alberta Children's Hospital. And I was the biomechanics research lead, and I worked across populations with juvenile idiopathic arthritis and cerebral palsy. And so this was a really neat opportunity to work directly with members of the neuromotor clinic, including orthopedic surgery, physiatry, and physiotherapy. And I was really fortunate, in a really fortunate position to be able to contribute to the research efforts on cerebral palsy. So CP describes a group of permanent disorders of the development of movement and posture, causing activity limitations that are attributed to non-progressive disturbances that occurred in the developing fetal or infant brain. And it is the leading cause of lifelong disability, with a prevalence of about 1 in 500 babies and 1 in 3 babies that are born prematurely. And these early disturbances of the developing brain are associated with a variety of clinical consequences that include spasticity, which is present in up to 90% of individuals with CP, joint stiffness, muscle weakness, shortened muscle tendon units, impaired selective motor control, bony deformities, decreased sensory feedback, and many children with CP also experience a greater sense of fatigue. And as you can see, I've highlighted a few of the key words which represent topics that I was able to delve into through our work at the ACH, and that I will touch on in my presentation today. But before I get started on the research, I wanted to try and make a quick case for why biomechanics. And hopefully I'm preaching to the choir here, given a biomechanics audience. But from a patient perspective, children and adolescents with CP identify safe and efficient mobility as a primary concern to enable participation in activities of daily living. And so clearly to them, gait is really important. And from a clinical perspective, gait analysis is recognized as playing an important role when used as part of an integrated clinical assessment. So including clinical history, physical examination, diagnostic imaging, and examinations under anesthesia. And here, the biomechanics piece, the biomechanics assessment, provides the opportunity to quantify the severity of dynamic involvement across multiple segments and multiple joints in order to inform appropriate surgical or non-surgical management. However, with the use of gait analysis comes the challenge of having to try to make sense of the gait deviations. So for a typically developing individual or a group of individuals, we would expect to see a knee flexion extension pattern during walking that looks something like this. So we're starting off with an extended knee joint at heel strike. We then go into some flexion as we're accommodating the weight of the body. We then go back to extension as the opposite leg is swinging forward. And finally, we go into knee flexion as we're getting ready for the swing phase of walking. But when it comes to children and adolescents with CP, we can see that things are a lot more variable. And the specific example here represents mean data for individuals with CP who attended the neuromotor clinic at the Alberta Children's Hospital. And this apparent variability can be observed not only at the knee, but across segments and joints of the lower body. And in fact, there's so many different patterns that even after doing a Delphi consensus study approach to try and narrow down on the different types of options, Nieuwenhuis and colleagues identified a total of 49 clinically important motion patterns. And so there is a need to simplify this information. And one of the approaches that is used clinically considers motions in the sagittal plane only, leading to the description of 4 major gait pattern types for individuals with hemiplegia and diplegia. So hemiplegia is where CP affects predominantly one side of the body, and diplegia where it affects both sides of the body. And another approach to quantifying the severity of involvement is to use gait indices, which essentially act as a type of summary score of the severity of involvement of different joints. And these gait indices have been shown to be sensitive outcome measures to assess the effects of interventions. But there are some concerns that arise from the use of these approaches. They rely on specially trained raters who perform a subjective rating of gait deviations, and this is time-consuming and therefore cost-intensive, and only few specialized centers can afford an investment in this. And most approaches use a subsection of gait abnormalities, so they're not inclusive of all limitations. And of course, once an individual transitions to adulthood, we generally lose track of them because they do not tend to come back to the hospital for this type of assessment. And the point I'm making here is not that I'm trying to make it sound like I'm trying to address those issues, but those are simply some of the barriers that repeatedly pop up for the implementation of biomechanics in the clinical domain. But these kind of issues did motivate the 3 topics that I would like to focus on today. And the first one takes me back to 2015, where I was trying to figure out how I, with no clinical knowledge and looking at this data for the very first time, can make sense of this apparent data variability. And I chose the path of machine learning for this. And then once I've determined some common gait patterns using machine learning, how can I show that they have some clinically useful information? So your big so what question. So for example, is there a relationship between groups of individuals with certain gait type deviation patterns and the severity of their clinical symptoms? And lastly, given that individuals with CP experience greater fatigue with exercise, can we determine associations between the way they move, so the movement biomechanics, and their metabolic energy expenditure? So I want to start here with the first topic, gait patterns and machine learning. As I showed previously, this was my starting point, and these are the data for a clinical database of children who attended the Alberta Children's Hospital for pre-surgical consult for complex intervention planning between 2007 and 2018. So it's data at the time of about 150 participants. So having access to this type of database is a really great starting point. And my research objective was to develop a machine learning approach to reveal clinically meaningful clusters of individuals with similar movement patterns. And to address this objective, I was working with a subset of 37 participants between the ages of 5 and 25, focusing on data for individuals with spastic diplegia and GMFCS levels 1 and 2, where GMFCS refers to the gross motor classification system, which is a 5-level scale that is used to determine the level of support an individual is likely to need throughout their life. So lowest severity is 1, highest severity is 5. And the participants walked on an instrumented walkway at their preferred walking speed. And for these participants, I obtained marker coordinates from a modified Helen-Hayes marker set. And I then calculated joint angles for the stance phase of walking using visual 3D. And based on the literature, I selected sagittal, coronal, and transverse plane angles for the hip, and sagittal plane angles for the knee and ankle joints. And these data were then first normalized in time so that I would have 101 data points representing the stance phase of walking. And I normalized the data with respect to their mean and range in order to minimize the effects of varying data ranges between different joints. And that's a pretty typical starting point for machine learning approach. And the normalized data were then combined in a 505 by 37 data matrix. So we have our 5 joint angles at 101 data points each and 37 individuals. And this data matrix was then used as input for the data clustering part of the pipeline, where I used k-means clustering with 2 to 5 random seeds. So what does that mean? K-means clustering it's an iterative process where we start the first point here, the data in gray. And then in the second point, we allocate a number of data points as cluster seeds. So as I said, in my approach, I tried 2, 3, 4, and 5 seeds. And I'm presenting here an illustration of how it would look for 2 seeds. And the data points that are closest to the initial seeds are then identified and are used to form a new temporary cluster. And the centroid of those clusters, of those temporary clusters, is then calculated. And that centroid, the new cluster centroid, is then effectively the new cluster seed. And then you go through an iterative process. Here it's the number 5, where you redefine the location of this cluster centroid by recalculating the points that are closest, that have the closest proximity to the centroid. And eventually, you end up with a solution where the position of that cluster centroid doesn't change location anymore. It comes to a minimum, and then you can select that as your clustering solution. And after the clustering is done, we have to decide how many clusters represent an acceptable solution. So is it 2, 3, 4, or 5 clusters? And to inform this decision, I use the silhouette function by Rousseau, where the blue bars here represent the silhouette value, which is a measure of the similarity of each piece of data with respect to data in its own cluster and compared to data in other clusters. So if you have a value of 1, that indicates that a piece of data is very closely associated with its own cluster centroid, whereas a value of 0 or negative values indicate that the data are less well situated within their own cluster, could be on the margins between cluster, and could also belong to other clusters. So now that we have those values, we have to make some decisions around how many clusters are acceptable. And my first approach was to look at the silhouette values in terms of their magnitude and how much data is allocated to each cluster. And admittedly, that's a fairly qualitative approach, but I use this as my first criterion, and I use this in order to hone in on the 4-cluster solution. And here the rationale was that I wanted to find the most clusters, the largest number of clusters that I could divide this data set into. And if I looked at more than 4 clusters, so the 5-cluster solution, I started to get a lot of negative values, and the clusters contained very little data. So they were getting very skinny because of the limited sample size that I was working with. So 4 clusters seemed better. And when I compared 4 clusters to 3 clusters, I also didn't think that in terms of the magnitude of the values, that really the 4-cluster solution was that much worse than the 3-cluster solution. So that was kind of my starting point around maybe there's something to 4 clusters, and maybe I prefer that over 3 clusters. But another way to look at this is to inform the decision based on the repeatability of the clustering. So I did the k-means clustering 3 times, And each time we had a random starting seat allocation. And so each time I run the algorithm, I might expect to get a slightly different solution. And what I'm showing in this figure is the frequency with which individuals in the data set changed cluster allocations across the 10 k-means repetitions. So each X represents a participant. On the X-axis, we have the mean silhouette value. And on the Y, we have the frequency of the change in cluster allocations. So we can see that one individual right at the top changed cluster allocations 4 times out of the 10 repetitions. Then we have 3 that changed twice, and we have 2 that changed clusters once. And when I look at the results in more detail, I found that for 2 and 3 clusters, participants never changed cluster allocations. So that was 100% repeatable. But that's also not really pushing the envelope on the maximum number of clusters that could be contained within the data set. When I used 4 clusters on the other hand, and that's the example that I'm showing here, I found that 6 individuals changed clusters at least once. And so overall, across the 10 repetitions, I had a repeatability of about 96.8%. And the fact that some of the data changed cluster allocations wasn't really surprising, because we can see that those individuals that did change clusters also had low silhouette values. So they were more likely to be on the margins between clusters. However, when I then took it one step further and I looked at the 5 cluster solution, there was no consistent pattern whatsoever. So the entire process of trying to identify how repeatable it is didn't work at all. So I definitely could rule out the 5 cluster solution. But I also decided that with a 96.8% repeatability, that probably indicates that that's as far as I can push this data in the first place. And I decided to take that solution forward to learn something about what these clusters are. So in order to learn something more about the clusters, I needed to determine what the functional differences were between the clusters. And for this, I used statistical parametric mapping in order to compare the mean joint angle curves for each cluster to a reference cluster of typically developing individuals. So here we have the comparisons for clusters 1, 2, 3, and 4, where we have the data for the individuals with CP in red and the reference data in green. And we also have a black line that is the T statistic that statistical parametric mapping is based around. And what that line indicates is whether it's essentially a visual representation of where in time 2 data sets are different from each other. And specifically, it's the shaded area that indicates that the T line has breached a threshold level where we can identify that the 2 curves or the 2 sets of curves are different from each other. And then we can use the information about the on and off of that shaded area in order to compare between the different clusters. And I should just mention that for the statistical analysis, I actually used the raw data rather than the normalized data, so that I would work with the actual angles, and the whole identification process, interpretation process would be a bit more intuitive. But rather than go through all of the joints one at a time, what I want to do here is show a summary table of the results. And the first thing that I want to draw your attention to is cluster 3, because this cluster did not differ from the reference group with respect to the coronal and transverse planes of the hip. Instead, the gait deviations were limited to the sagittal plane of the hip, knee, and ankle joints. And here the durations comparatively weren't that large. And so overall, this indicates that this particular cluster appeared to have the least severe involvement in terms of gait differences. If we then look at cluster 4, we can see that this cluster had the longest durations for hip and knee joint extension deficits, as well as the unique ankle dorsiflexion pattern, in-terminal stance, and pre-swing. So this cluster very much appears to resemble a crouch-like walking pattern with a combination of knee extension deficit, so more flexion, and greater hip flexion and ankle dorsiflexion. And then my last example here is cluster number 1, And in cluster number 1, we had the most substantial deviations in the coronal and transverse planes of the hip. And that observation was really neat because it was in line with the observation, with new observations through this Delphi consensus study that I talked about before, where that group identified that continuous hip abduction and excessive external rotation are identified for 9%, so a small subset of individuals with spastic CP. And similar for our data, we identified the small subgroup for about 13% of our cohort. So there was some really neat alignment there. And so for the first section here, what did we learn from the use of machine learning for this gait clustering? And the first thing that we learned is that gait clustering resulted in a maximum of 4 clusters. And these clusters displayed distinct combinations of multi-joint deficits. And the deficit patterns appear to reflect the severity of the involvement, and they show distinct similarity to common clinical descriptors. So at this stage, I was really happy that this approach allowed me to put some structure to these really variable gait patterns. However, of course, this approach has limitations, and especially in terms of the sample size that I was working with, the broad age range of the individuals that form part of that cohort, and the fact that I could not evaluate if individuals assigned to the clusters also met the clinical criteria for specific gait classifications. But at least at this stage, that wasn't really part of my intention, because I was trying to identify what are ways to simplify the data, and rather than trying to kind of reframe clinical conventions. And so after having some success and after putting some structure to these data, I now wanted to see if the clusters mean something. Do they contain some clinically useful information? So one area of clinical interest is the relationship between gait and spasticity. And spasticity may be described as a velocity-dependent, increase in tonic stretch reflexes with exaggerated tendon jerks. And as part of the clinical assessment at the ACH, spasticity was defined for the hamstrings, or was quantified for the hamstrings and the tricepsurae muscles using the modified Tardieu scale, where the neural component of joint stiffness, or the spasticity, relates to the differences in the angle of arrest, so where you feel a resistance to moving the joint, between a slow movement, where you don't get the resistance because you don't induce those reflexes, and a rapid movement where you induce those reflexes. And the non-neural component, on the other hand, is when we move the joint slowly, and that is then related to things like altered soft tissue properties and joint contraction. And to me, it seemed intuitive that spasticity could or should have an effect on gait mechanics, or at least that there should be an association of the two. However, some of the existing evidence on possible associations was not very encouraging. So, for example, Nieuwenhuis and colleagues did not identify any strong associations between the magnitude of gait parameters or functional scores and measures of muscle weakness or spasticity. And the issue here might come back to the variability that we talked about and that we've seen before. And what are our decisions around which measures are most appropriate for comparison? So what aspects of gait are likely affected by spasticity, and do our selected kinematic measures really reflect this? And on a broader concept, spasticity might be thought to result in a more severe crouch walking pattern, so greater and continuous flexion at the hips and knees. And that's a concept that Rosomalski and Schwartz investigated when they reported that they investigated. And what they reported was a really interesting finding, and that there wasn't a nice linear relationship between the magnitude of spasticity and knee flexion angle, but rather that there is a cluster of individuals with moderate crouch, so moderate knee flexion angles, and walking in a plantar flexion at the ankle that had the greatest spasticity. So those two observations raise an interesting question. So the first one is, which features of gait are associated with spasticity, and how do we consider multi-joint interactions in our analysis? And so to formalize this, what I wanted to do was to determine if there's an association between the neural and non-neural aspects of the MTS for the hamstrings and triceps surae, and clusters of hip, knee, and ankle joint patterns for individuals with CP. So for this analysis, we used a sample of 51 male and female participants with GMFCS levels 1 and 2 with a median age of 10 years old. The important difference for the study was that the data for the hip, knee, and ankle joints were not combined into one data matrix, but instead were analyzed separately. And also the analysis was conducted for mean and range normalized data, as well as for non-normalized data. And I will explain the rationale for this in a couple of slides. The data clustering was then performed again using k-means clustering. And finally, we used linear regression analysis to assess the associations of MTS measures and data clusters. So regarding the question of why did we try both normalized and non-normalized data, the decision was based on the fact that we wanted to identify which gauge features are associated with spasticity. And we didn't know if those features were related to differences in the timing or differences in the magnitude between joint angles. And so there's an easy way to illustrate this. On the left-hand side, we have our raw data that's time normalized. And then we perform mean and range normalization of that data, followed by k-means clustering. And we can see the solutions here for 3 clusters. And the resultant clusters illustrate that we largely ignore differences in the angle magnitudes, but instead we highlight differences in the timing of joint excursions. And I will go into more detail about what differences we can see just shortly here. Without normalization, differences in the magnitude of the angles are more important, leading to very different looking clusters for the same data. And so we might be masking some of the information that's related to the timing. And unlike what we did before, where we combined everything into one data matrix, and I was using this normalization in order to make sure that we can compare a hip with a knee with an ankle, this approach here was really based at trying to tease out, are we looking at differences in timing? What are those differences? Or what type of differences in magnitude are we dealing with? So for kind of more detailed information about what's happening with the normalized data and the selection of clusters. So at the hip, we had 2 clusters. At the ankle and knee, we had 3 clusters respectively. And for the sake of the statistical testing, what we did is that we labeled the pattern with the least severe deviations as our reference cluster. So that's the solid line. And then we have clusters A and B. Those are the other patterns in the dotted and dashed lines respectively. And again, this is done purely for the sake of communicating the statistical findings. So what are the differences that we were able to observe? At the hip, so on the far left, we had cluster A that was missing the initial hip flexion extension peak, and there was a more rapid progression into hip extension. So that's the dotted line. And at the knee, there were clear differences at heel strike and with respect to the timing of peak knee extension, where clusters A and B had an earlier extension peak. And at the ankle, dorsiflexion angles took the form of some really unique patterns, where cluster B especially displays an early dorsiflexion peak with a pronounced dorsiflexion deficit during terminal stance. And that always confused me, what's going on here. But what's actually happening is that through the normalization process, we amplified the appearance of this early dorsiflexion peak because the joint actually stays plantar flexed but because we're doing this mean and range normalization, we're shifting the data up and it's taking on this unique shape. And so for the statistical analysis of the joint clusters and MTS values, we used linear regression, where the clusters were considered as categorical variables and MTS values were dependent variables. And we also considered interaction terms of the hip and knee clusters with respect to the hamstrings, because the hamstrings are two joint muscles and affect the hip as well as the knee. So I thought it was reasonable to assume that there might be an effect on both. The analysis for the normalized data then revealed really interesting findings, where the hamstring spasticity was significantly greater for knee clusters with an early knee extension peak, where MTS values were 13 and 10 degrees higher for clusters A and B with respect to the reference cluster. And this association between early knee extension and spasticity was really interesting because it hadn't been reported previously in the literature. And there were no other significant findings that we could observe. And also there were no associations with respect to the passive joint range of motion. With respect to the non-normalized data, we observed the same number of clusters as we did for the normalized data, which was really convenient for the sake of writing this up as a paper. But it can easily be seen that the pattern differences here were related to the differences in the magnitude of the joint excursions. So we could see a greater hip extension deficit, we could see increasingly severe knee extension deficits, and we could see increasing ankle dorsiflexion deficits. And the statistical analysis then allowed us to identify an interaction amongst hip and knee patterns with respect to the magnitude of hamstring spasticity. And in this case, hamstring spasticity was greater in participants with a hip extension deficit combined with moderate knee extension deficit, whereas there were no differences for participants with greater knee extension deficit. So if we think back to a few slides ago, this was actually a really exciting finding because the interaction of hip and knee movement patterns kind of mirrors the findings of the Schwartz group at the Gillette Children's Hospital in the US, who found the interaction between moderate hip knee extension deficit together with more plantar flexion. But it hadn't been observed with respect to the interactions between hip and knee. And finally, spasticity of the gastroc tended to be larger for ankle clusters with the greatest dorsiflexion deficit. And the highlighted ankle pattern here was unique in that it provided evidence for the associations of both spasticity and range of motion measures from the MTS. So in this case, range of motion was lower for clusters with greater dorsiflexion deficits. And this indicates that both spasticity and contracture or structural changes likely played a role in how the ankle joint was moving and how the ankle joint was staying in plantar flexion. So in summary, the approach of normalizing and non-normalizing data revealed that there were unique patterns that differed in terms of the timing and the magnitude of joint excursions. And we were able to provide a unique insight on associations between greater hamstring spasticity and knee clusters with an early knee extension pattern. And we were able to confirm observations of greater hamstring spasticity for combined hip extension and moderate knee extension deficits. And finally, we observed that participants with greater ankle dorsiflexion deficits tended to have greater spasticity and lower range of motion. So why is this important? Because evaluating the dynamic effects of interventions aimed at reducing spasticity and contracture requires that we have measures that are likely going to change in response of these interventions. And I believe that the timing and magnitude related features that we were able to find provide an important information, and that they will hopefully play an important role in evaluating the effects of interventions in this population. So after all of this, I was really happy that these machine learning-based approaches enabled me to let the data tell me something about gait and spasticity in CP. And so I was really enthusiastic about trying to tackle the last issue, which is the relationship between an individual's movement biomechanics and their metabolic energy expenditure. So as I mentioned earlier, the motivation for this work was the proposed relationship between the experience of greater fatigue with physical activity and the greater metabolic demand in CP. But fatigue is a really loose term that I'm not completely comfortable with, unlike metabolic energy expenditure, where we have a long track record of being able to quantify that. And importantly, gait mechanics have long been thought to contribute to the cost of locomotion. And I remember the paper by Curry and Crompton really well from my PhD days, where they talk about a 1.7 times greater cost of locomotion when adopting a crouch walking pattern. However, when Steele and colleagues investigated this concept for children with cerebral palsy, the results weren't promising. They only found modest associations at best. And then Kurtz and colleagues and Wies and Schwartz had more success with respect to inefficiencies in converting metabolic energy to redirecting the center of mass during gait. And that's great, but conceptually, I'm more interested in the ideas by Sparrow and Newell, who postulated that effective movement coordination could be an important contributor to metabolic energy expenditure. And while there's anecdotal evidence for this, I was surprised that that concept didn't appear to be explored for children with cerebral palsy. So I was keen to try and investigate whether or not that hypothesis holds true for individuals with CP. But in order to be able to do that, what I needed was a new approach. And kind of unfortunately, that was during the height of the first wave of COVID. And I had a lot of time that I could play with in order to try and learn a new tool and play with some data to see if I could figure out something new. And so the data set I was able to use for this study was based on a cohort study where we were measuring fatigue in individuals with CP using an adapted 6-minute walk test on a treadmill. And for the study, we had 56 male and female participants. 25 of these individuals had CP, and they walked at a self-selected speed on a treadmill with the aim of walking as far as they could in 6 minutes. And part of the measures that we took during this collection were their movement biomechanics using motion analysis and metabolic energy expenditure using a portable K5 system from Cosmet. From the metabolic data, we obtained the gross metabolic cost of walking with respect to walking speed for each participant. And from a first glance at the data, we can see that it follows roughly our expectations, where metabolic cost increases with increasing severity of CP. So we have the participants that are GMFCS level 1 in red. We have the combination of level 2 and 3 in blue. And we have the age and sex match typically developing controls in the green. And the gait biomechanics data was then processed in a slightly different fashion than before. So instead of calculating joint angles, I calculated segment angles of the thigh and shank with respect to the lab coordinate system. So effectively, that provides a measure of the up and down pitch of the segment. And this was possible because participants walked in a fixed location on the treadmill, and the treadmill was aligned with respect to the lab coordinate system, so they couldn't deviate mediolaterally while they were walking, which is always a concern in this population. And so in the figure, what I'm showing is example data of the change in the thigh and shank segment angles over multiple consecutive steps, indicated by the HS, by the heel strikes. If we now want to quantify the relationship of the motion of one segment with respect to the other, we can calculate their phase relationship. That is, if the segments are moving in unison or not. And there are a number of different means to do these calculations. And after some review, I decided to go with the approach by that's recommended by Lamm and Stöckel. And then that's to calculate the continuous relative phase. So first the data is centered, and then we can calculate the phase relationship between the shank and the thigh. And so the continuous relative phase indicates whether the shank and thigh move in phase, which is values close to 0, or if they're moving anti-phase. And an anti-phase behavior can be positive. So that's when the shank trails behind the thigh. And for this, we get the larger positive peaks. And that's something that we would expect to see during the swing phase of gait. So that's what we can see in that graph on the third plot. But the relationship can also be negative, and for this, the shank would have to move ahead of the thigh. But for the human body, that's a really difficult thing to achieve during walking. So we tend to see positive values during the swing and kind of 0 values during the loading response. And the general hypothesis was that metabolic energy expenditure would increase with increasing magnitude of coordination deficits. And 2 fairly simple metrics that we can extract from this, from the continuous relative phase curve, would be the maximum CRP and would be the minimum CRP values for each stride. And for this data, I had data for the right and left leg. So I decided to actually select the data for the leg with the highest values, because to me, they indicated a greater severity of involvement. And we know that the severity of involvement can differ between the right and the left legs. And I was interested in what's the more severe case, or what's the more severely affected side, and how is that related to energy expenditure. So now I'm showing a summary of the maximum and minimum CRP values for GMFCS levels 1 and the combination of GMFCS levels 2 and 3 compared to typically developing controls. And the first thing that we can see is that those individuals in GMFCS level 1 had significantly larger maximum CRP values, indicating that the shank lagged behind the thigh more significantly during the swing phase. And individuals with GMFCS levels 2 and 3 had significantly elevated CRP max and min values. So that indicates that the shank consistently lagged behind the thigh throughout the gait cycle. And we can also see that compared to GMFCS level 1, the max and min values were 3 times larger than the less severe involvement. So now let's take this data and try to relate it to the energy expenditure. So the first thing that we did was we account for the metabolic data, was to account for the effects of stature and walking speed, which are known to affect estimates of metabolic energy expenditure. For this, we used the Fruit number, which is essentially velocity squared times gravity and leg length. And that's an approach to try and normalize the data somewhat. However, we see that data at the top left, but that that way of dealing with the data didn't result in linear data. And so I applied log transformation to this in order to allow me to have an easier time with doing the statistical analysis. Because for the statistics, I used multiple linear regression with using CRP max and min, as well as the maximum knee extension deficit angle as inputs. And the reason I chose, I also included the knee angle, though the knee flexion angle effectively, is because that was used in previous research. And it's always nice to align your findings, your new findings with existing data. And the findings from this analysis showed a strong association of CRP max and the metabolic rate of walking. So the metabolic cost increased 1.7 times with each degree increase in CRP max. But the CRP, like the minimum value and the knee extension angle, didn't appear to have a meaningful contribution to this. And so now I was excited because the association of CRP max and metabolic cost was strong, and the data looked sensible, and the data kind of reaffirmed my worldview of coordination should be related to energy expenditure and vice versa. And it's always nice to have a bit of positive feedback. But more importantly, we were able to learn something new about energy expenditure and coordination in individuals with CP. So thigh and shank coordination was generally more antiphase in individuals with CP, indicating coordination deficits. And those coordination deficits were larger for individuals with more severe involvement. And I'm really hoping that I didn't miss a paper, but I believe that this is the first paper that's determined the association between coordination and metabolic cost of walking in CP. And that would be really great because it supports the idea that coordination deficits could be an important contributor to metabolic demands in this population. I would be really interested in trying to figure out if interventions that improve coordination could have an effect on reducing metabolic costs of walking. And there is some good evidence in support of this idea based on the effects of multi-level surgery, dorsal rhizotomy, as well as gait training. But there's still some uncertainty around this topic. And so what really is needed is a good longitudinal cohort study with post-intervention follow-up to try and answer this question. And I believe that the combination of coordination and metabolic energy cost will be important in trying to address this question. Okay, so I'm done earlier than I thought I would be, but that's my CP gait journey. There's a lot left that could be done and that should be done. And I'm hoping that I was able to show that by throwing everything but the kitchen sink at this topic, we were able to learn some kind of, able to gain some key kind of unique insights into this topic. And I definitely enjoyed the process of trying to figure out what tools work in order to address in which question a lot. That was really a lot of fun. And I feel like we've really been able to keep up with the big competition, the kind of institutes that kind of are the leaders in this research area, and we're able to contribute some unique insights in terms of gait clustering, how gait is related, or what the interactions are between gait and spasticity, as well as gait and energy expenditure. And that's the end of my presentation. I would like to thank all the institutions that were involved in this, all the great people that I had a pleasure to work with during this time, and a special thanks to Carolyn and Janet for letting me get on with it and helping to move this area of research forward.
Thank you, Gregor. Great. At this time, I'd kindly ask the audience members that if they're comfortable to please turn on their Zoom camera to allow for a better discussion. And Gregor, maybe I can ask you to stop sharing your screen. Question in the chat box, and I will read it aloud. So Gregor, maybe I'll start with a question. In your first clustering study where you narrowed in on 4 clusters, I think that population was 2 severity groups. Did this clinical severity level at all relate to the 4 clusters you determined?
Oh, yeah, okay. So it was a mixture. I see what you're saying. It definitely was a mixture of individuals. So I think I said GMFCS levels 1 and 2. So individuals that are independently mobile, And yes, there's a bit of a trade-off. So if you define it by GMFCS level, so GMFCS level basically tells you whether or not you have difficulties in kind of activities of daily living and different kind of functional tasks like walking upstairs, and if you can kind of do this assisted or unassisted. And so whether or not the GMFCS level directly relates to how severe the gait involvement is, you probably have some with a kind of that are GMFCS level 1 that might be more severely affected by than somebody who's a really good GMFCS level 2. And so the short answer is probably what I'm hoping is that the gait clusters reflect the kind of the severity of the involvement and which combination of joints are involved for the group overall. But I'm not sure that it necessarily holds true that there is also a relationship with this cluster only contains individuals that are GMFCS level 1 or GMFCS level 2. I tried that and I never had any success with that.
Great, thank you. Art, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, we had a glitch in the audio, so I didn't hear all of Emily's question. And from listening to Gregor's response, I wonder if I'm just asking Emily's question again by mistake. So tell me.
It would make my life really easy.
Tell me if it's the same question. So the first part of your talk, you're using unsupervised machine learning techniques, and you're saying, okay, I got these clusters. And I thought at that time that you were doing that because you don't like the clinical classifications. But then the latter part of your talk, you're using the clinical classifications and not using the clusters. And so from that, I'm just wondering, do you prefer to use the clinical classifications, or do you prefer to let the machine tell you the classifications?
So I never use the clinical classifications because I don't have access to them. I can't ask somebody to do it for me because nobody's got time for that. And so basically the task is, how can I go about trying to tease this out? And personally, I prefer letting machine learning algorithms tell you the question, but they're very much different things for different purposes. And so for the purpose of identifying whether there's a relationship between a cluster and metabolic energy expenditure and so on, I preferred my approach. There are lots of positives about trying clustering approaches or related approaches, but there's also negatives in terms of they're not necessarily clinically useful. So really I'm using them from the research perspective and trying to see if we can make them clinically useful. So if we identify that there is a relationship with spasticity, and we can maybe monitor whether or not an intervention that's aimed at reducing spasticity really results in a certain biomechanical change, then that's useful. So that's kind of the approach that I took.
Okay.
And all of the learning approaches were all non-supervised.
Okay, I'm going to accuse you of not being a true believer in the unsupervised method.
Why?
Because a true believer in unsupervised learning doesn't classify anything, and yet it seems, or maybe I misunderstood, but it seemed like you ran your cluster analysis on the CP kids, and so they were already divided from the TD kids, typically developed, and so I believe a true believer in unsupervised learning would just throw everything, all the data into the clusters and see if it sorts out. And then maybe you would get a cluster that corresponds to the typically developing children, maybe not. And then you have to live with that.
Sure, that would be great. If you have that data, throw it at me. I'll happily work with that. But the data that I work with.
I thought you were comparing against the typically developing
different cohorts. So like what I had to use for my reference in the first study, which was the pure clustering study, was that I had to use literature references. But literature references aren't the same as collecting your own data. So effectively, I didn't have my own data. I had to find a compromise, and I had to use that compromise. And that compromise was okay for that study, but it isn't okay for the purpose of clustering individuals. So you really have to have a data set that is homogeneous in terms of the way that you collected and you processed the data. So I didn't have, if I had access to healthy controls for this particular, or typically developing controls for that particular study, I would have happily used it, but I didn't have access to it. Later on, when it comes to the second study, the third study, where we looked at energy expenditure, there we had our own cohort of individuals walking on a treadmill, and there we had this matched setup of individuals with and without CP. So that would have been kind of useful for that. But by that time, I'd already published that paper.
I see. Okay, so I understand, and I agree with you about that choice. But I feel like to really sell the unsupervised learning, that should have included the TD children, and then we would want to see whether that gets sorted out from the clusters.
Yeah, that would have been great. I would expect that they look really different. Yeah.
Michael, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Gregor. Interesting talk. I liked the metabolic data. It was quite interesting. And the one thing I noticed was that the walking speeds were quite different between the three groups. And I was wondering how much of the difference in energy cost can just be associated with the difference in walking speed.
That's a really good question. I haven't seen that a low walking speed would result in the kind of metabolic differences, like the kind of increased metabolic demands that we've seen for individuals with CP. Like they seem to be far higher than what I might expect from I've done comparisons with the literature and tried to see where this roughly lines up, which is always super challenging because everybody kind of works with slightly different like a slightly different version of metabolic energy. So if it be like gross or net or with respect to different metrics, so kind of aligning data with respect to other data is always super challenging. But I haven't seen that the lower walking speeds would result really in that large of a difference. And one of the purposes of using the fruit number is try to accommodate for some of those speed-related differences. So there's probably a component for it, but hopefully we managed to kind of keep some of it under control.
Is there any data across, like in children with various degrees of CP, like metabolic cost data across running speeds? So kind of like you see these nice U-shaped curved and typically developing individuals. Do we see something similar in children with CP? Or is it?
That's a great question. I don't know. I expect that it's probably more related. Really great question. So first of all, running speeds, you'd have to have a very specific subset of individuals to be able to get running speeds, but probably for walking speeds.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a really tough question. Like those were the speeds that they were using were the speeds that they were comfortable walking at, is kind of like a high comfortable, and they think that they could achieve 6 minutes of that. But a range, getting a true range of different walking speeds for this type of population, I'm not sure that somebody's done that, because that's really challenging to try and do. It might be out there, but I haven't looked closely enough to try and tease that out. Typically, what always irritates me about kind of metabolic energy expenditure and children with CP is the kind of the general statement of individuals with CP have 2 to 3 times higher metabolic energy expenditure. And when I look at my data, that's not really true. It really depends on how severe your involvement is. And then kind of it seems to depend on how coordinated the movement is. And it seems to be a fairly linear relationship between the two. So that, I think that seems more, that's more what I'm interested in.
Thank you. Really interesting stuff.
Thanks.
I'm going to read a question from the chat. Did you use joint angular velocity or force data for clustering?
I use joint angles for clustering. But there are lots of different measures that could be used for trying clustering. So my analysis was all based on joint angles. But you know, there's lots of work that's being done in joint kinetics, so joint movements that could be used, and lots of derivatives of that as well.
Great. Walter, please go ahead.
I should just say the reason I picked the joint angles is because, you know, at the end of the day, I have to speak to somebody like Gina, who's in the audience, who's a clinician, and then I have to explain what is going on with the data. And the data that's really key to making clinical decisions is kinetics data, so joint angles. That's kind of the holy grail.
Good. I guess it's me. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Gregor. That was really interesting. I have about 17,000 questions. Trying to find which ones I might want to have answered here quickly. I guess the first one is, in the first couple of studies in the supervised learning, if I saw it correctly, you only looked at the stance phase, whereas in the third one, you brought in the swing phase. And when you were talking about the first two studies, I was really surprised why not the swing phase, because I would have assumed that they show very, very distinct differences from typically developing children as well.
Oh, absolutely. And actually they do. So in the first the first iteration of this is the clinical data set, and there the emphasis is trying to get the combination of kinematics and kinetics, and they step on the force plate, and that's easy data to get out. And then it takes a lot more effort to try and figure out when the second seal strike happens. So I'll be honest, it was convenient to work with data that involve very little data processing to try and get at what are these things that are happening. And then for the second study, actually, where I looked at the interaction with spasticity, what I did there is to actually also, so kind of I finished the paper off and said, okay, this is all done for this for the stance phase and looks pretty good. I bet it's better when I include the swing phase. And it turned out it told the same story, but it was much easier to do when you included swing phase, because there are a number of other things that are happening in the swing phase. And I think if I had the time, I would definitely go back and try to tease out exactly what's going on when you're including the swing phase.
And another question that I had is, you know, you're always talking about spasticity, but these children typically have like what we call an inherent stiffness, and then the spasticity. And I seem to have read articles where, you know, where they looked at gait before and after Botox injection. And Botox injection, of course, you know, if they're done fully, then they would inhibit the spasticity because they don't allow the muscles to be activated anymore. And some of them seem to suggest that there was actually not that much success with Botox injections, which then might suggest that it might be the inherent stiffness that plays a greater role. And I was wondering if you have ever tried to look at that.
Well, so in that study, in the study, we looked at both the neural and the non-neural aspects. So that's your spasticity plus its joint contracture and other things that are preventing the joint into going through a full range of motion. So we tried to look at both, and at the ankle, we observed that full range of, so that the non-neural piece, the part of it, and the neural part both seem to be affecting the way, or showing an association with how the ankle was moving. And that the knee, we were only able to identify associations with respect to the spasticity. That doesn't mean that the contracture and so on doesn't affect the gait. And I think definitely one of the things to move forward with is trying to identify, well, what actually happens with these observed relationships when you try to intervene in the spasticity process. So when you use something like Botox, how do the data change? Because then the whole kinematic chain is affected as well. So the whole movement process is also affected. So it depends a little bit on, do you believe that the Botox affects the spasticity, or does the Botox affect the way that you move afterwards? And I can see why it might be challenging to necessarily move very differently when that's the way that you always move. And one of the things is that individuals with spasticity will use their spasticity in order to move. And so when you modify that, I don't know what the time course is in order to come back to a new walking pattern.
So one of the ways to get at that might be if you measure simultaneously EMG data and see whether or not there's a big burst there in the EMG that you wouldn't expect. And I didn't see any of that. So I assume you did not measure EMG. Is that correct?
No, we did throw that tool at it as well. That's part of my regular toolbox. It's just I ran out of time. I didn't have time to look at that in more detail.
Okay, yeah, I think that might be really interesting. And, you know, to go further with the EMG, another question that I would have had is there that when you look at the coordination piece, you know, in your third study there, I would assume that the EMG would give you a lot of information also on the coordination, and maybe when you have that, what did you call it, that aphasic, that, you know, then the not normal coordination, that probably would also be then obviously associated with abnormal EMG patterns, and maybe even a lot of co-contraction. And then of course, if you have co-contraction, that would also contribute presumably to energetic cost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Just maybe a last question that I have. In the last study, in the third study, you also looked at you know, level 3, clinical level 3 children. And it's my understanding that those can only walk with some kind of a walking assistance. Is that correct? Or did they walk freely on the treadmill?
Well, they walked with handrail support.
Okay. And so they did support themselves on the side of the treadmill. Yeah. And that of course is an interesting aspect, because, you know, how much energy reduction might that potentially provide if a child who can walk independently, you know, with a GMFCS level 1, if that child then supported itself on the side, you know.
So we only had individuals that couldn't walk independently hold onto the handrails.
Also, they all held on to the handrails.
Not everybody held on to them. Only the individuals that couldn't walk without the support.
Yeah, and I was wondering how much difference that would make in terms of energetic cost.
And some of that is physical and some of it is psychological. Yeah.
Yeah. And just a comment that I wanted to throw out there, because at the very beginning you said, you know, it's sometimes hard to get adults coming back for studies and that type of thing. And, you know, I have a friend with 2 children with cerebral palsy. And she was telling me that really one of the very strange things in the medical system is that these children are, you know, looked at by children's doctors and in the children's hospital. But once they are, I don't know what it is, 20, I think, then they fall out of that. And so the doctor they had for 20 years cannot be their doctor anymore, and they have to go somewhere else. And you know, that seems a very strange arrangement for an efficient medical system to help these children. And then the adults, and maybe one of the medical people can comment on that if that's still the case, and how that potentially could be overcome.
Yeah, and I think some of that stems out of the, you know, when can you intervene in the process, and a lot of the intervention is done when they're children, and then when you're an adult and you kind of hypothesize that everything kind of stays very the same, there isn't much more that you can contribute to improving gait and function. And then what is the rationale for keeping to come back? But for sure, the clinicians would be in a much better position to address that than I would be. It's just a shame, because I think there's a lot of information that gets lost.
Yeah. If I just could make a comment to that, you know, because when I think of CP, I think of it from a muscle point of view. And for me, the point of view is essentially the bones grow, but the muscles do not longitudinally, and therefore the functional ability decreases as long as you grow, and as an adult you don't grow anymore. So then it stabilizes, but of course the problem is still there. But inherently, you know, not the brain lesion obviously, but the manifestation on the musculoskeletal level is really because there seems to be a problem with sarcomerogenesis, and these children have very long sarcomeres and not enough sarcomeres in series. and therefore they have these very high passive forces that are there, which is an intriguing aspect. Anyway, why does sarcomerogenesis not work in these children?
Yeah, but of course, if you lose them and then when they're in kind of adults, then of course you also kind of, unless you provide conduct specific research for this, you kind of lose that information about how much function can be maintained through certain interventions for as long as possible to keep individuals being independently mobile or active. Yeah. So that's I think that's where there needs to be more attention.
And that would be really neat, actually, because all the CP research that I've read is always on children. Nothing is on adult, and I think that's really an area that could potentially really benefit from some attention.
Yeah, it's definitely an area of growth and aging in cerebral palsy. There's certainly more attention being paid, and I think more attention needs to be paid. Our current healthcare system is definitely set up in terms of a pediatric system and an adult system. And the pediatric system, certainly a lot of the considerations that we're looking at in children with cerebral palsy are related to issues of growth. And we certainly, the system certainly could benefit from considering the needs of adults with cerebral palsy to a greater extent, and adults, many different types of adults needs in a greater perspective as well. So I'll leave that at that.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Rob, please go ahead.
Gregor, I'm thinking of the sequence of events from neural deficit through to each of your biomechanical parameters that you're looking at. And I'm wondering, there are lots of parameters. I'm wondering which ones are possibly the easiest to try and reverse. What is it? Reggie Edgerton in Los Angeles does transcutaneous spinal stimulation in CP kids and gets some improvement in coordination, and I'm not sure all the other things he sees improvement in, but that's he's trying to improve the neural activation. I'm wondering, he's coming that way, you've got the biomechanics at this end. I'm wondering which of your components you can tie to the neural deficit more directly, and therefore what's the low-hanging fruit? Which of your biomechanical measurements would you like to see, or do you think is most easily reversed if Reggie was able to improve the neural stimulation and to make it more normal? Is there something that, do you think about the neural aspect of each of these things with the view that if it was reversed, this would have so many follow-on improvements?
I think that's a really challenging question, so thank you. I think one of the problems is that it happens so early, and it depends on what area of the brain and to what severity the brain is affected. And then it happened after that initial insult, what happens in terms of the neural pathways and the kind of the development of the kind of the contralateral pathways, and how many of the ipsilateral pathways are maintained, how much kind of crosstalk is there that affects the motion, and then how much kind of activity is the individual involved in, and how does that affect their ability, kind of their coordination and their ability to walk. So some work is being done on kids with CP in order to do kind of early gait training to try and reinforce the pathways that are existing and trying to kind of help promote kind of as normal a pathway development as possible, or as optimal for the individual pathway as possible. But I think, can we affect the way that we move through neural stimulation? There are probably lots of ways that could be beneficial, but I'm not sure exactly how exactly that would manifest at the end of the day, because it affects so many joints and the interaction of so many joints all at the same time. So it's probably more of a global effect than it is a localized effect. And it probably comes down to kind of more kind of whole body coordination than what exactly is happening at the knee joint. Because if you optimize something somewhere, then something else, or if you interfere with something at some level, then some other level will have to come in and compensate for that. And you see that oftentimes in kind of surgical interventions, and especially in multi-level surgical interventions, where if you try to reposition the muscle attachment at one segment, then you might lose your ability to help stabilize the joint at another level. And so all of these things are interlinked, and it comes down to, I had lots of conversations with the team at the ACH about exactly how difficult these things are to achieve. And a lot of things also in the past haven't worked, and people have been trying to figure out how to improve those. So especially with the tendon lengthening and things like that. That can be challenging because the adaptations are so interlinked.
Yeah.
Also with like I said about the spasticity reduction, if you take away the spasticity, then you take away an aspect of that individual has been using effectively for trying to walk, but as effectively as they can. And so there's a positive and a negative. But what I'm excited about is that some of the gait training seems to help overall with improving coordination. So that there seems to be something that could be beneficial there.
When they do the gait training, do they see, are they able to get the muscles to respond? Can you make can you actually get them to activate the extensor versus the flexor and see an improvement in muscle dimensions? I'm not familiar.
And unfortunately, I don't know the literature well enough to talk about that, but I think that's an area that a lot of people are interested in.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I just don't know that particular aspect of it well enough.
Yeah. Thank you, Greg.
Emily, would you allow me to follow up quickly on this? Because some 30 years ago, Tim Leonard and I did work, in cats, and it's actually very easy to implant nerve cuff electrodes and stimulate muscles whenever you want, and also block whenever you want them. And so we did these experiments where we artificially stimulated muscles and then saw what the perturbation was, or inhibited muscles from activation, what the perturbation was. And I always felt that using that technology in humans, for example, in children with cerebral palsy, would actually be relatively straightforward, because I think, if Reggie Edgerton stimulates muscles at the right times, that is good. But to me, that's not the problem. The problem is that you need to inhibit the unwanted stimulation that comes naturally in these spasticity things. And so I think the tools to implement, certain major nerves with blocking and stimulating electrodes would be relatively straightforward. And knowing when to stimulate the muscle would also be relatively straightforward. But the problem that I have not been able to solve yet in my own mind, otherwise I would have approached a clinician, is how do we recognize the signature of the unwanted signal so that we can block it at the right time? And if somebody has a really good idea on how you can recognize that and then immediately put in the blocking electrode to not let that signal go through, but then stimulate or only let the signal through that you actually want, that would really be a cool thing, And so I think, technically speaking, controlling, at least with the major nerves, that type of activation, deactivation would not really be that difficult, but recognizing what you actually need to filter out and block, I just don't know how you would do that.
And I think the challenge is also that the spasticity is one aspect of a lot of different aspects that are happening with these kids.
But my hypothesis is, if you were able to control the spasticity, then you probably would also control much of the changes that occur on the muscular level. because when you look at the non-spastic muscles in these children, they seem to be perfectly normal.
Mhm.
So this is not systemic, that all muscles have these are shortened, all muscles have these elongated sarcomeres, and all muscles have these fibrotic nature and the fibrotic tissue. It seems to be very, very specific to the spastic muscles, and so it's not a systemic thing. So I assume it's directly related to the stimulation input, so that the stimulation that gets this wrong stimulation is actually producing the peripheral effect on the spastic muscles. But anyway, just speculation.
I think that Reggie Edgerton is halfway between the central nervous system insult and the muscles. He's not actually stimulating individual muscles. He's stimulating higher up, so that he's trying. It gives a coordinated stimulation. It doesn't actually choose or try to take the individual muscles. And I think that's the pathway he's going. He's not trying to pick the muscles and stimulate it that way.
And that's what people do with spinal cord injured people now. Hey, like Vivian Mushawar up in Edmonton, doing stimulation on the spinal cord level.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Some fabulous work there. Yeah.
Great. I think we'll wrap things up there. Gregor, thank you so much for your presentation today, and thank you to all the audience members for their questions. I hope to see everyone again next week, where we'll be hearing from Fabian Hortz from Johannes Gutenberg University in Germany. So thank you again, and see everyone next week.